Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of Global Go Connect's webinar series. My name is Simone Sandoval, and I'm the Director of Licensing and Compliance for Global Go. We are a first-in-class cannabis consulting firm providing end-to-end solutions for the global cannabis industry, with affiliate offices in the US, Mexico, Colombia, Ecuador, Brazil, Cyprus, the UK, Switzerland, and Africa. Today's topic will be on Global Go and FTI's annual report on cannabis law and markets, or what we refer to as the ultimate cannabis playbook. Now, regulatory rules drive outcomes in cannabis, impacting everything from product diversification to growing your consumer base to revenue growth rates. And the net result is a strong growth in a global market that grew 42% to $21.7 billion in 2020, and is forecast to grow at a compound annual growth rate of 19% to $51.7 billion in 2021. Now, aiding this discussion will be fellow co-authors here to cover their respective regions around the globe, including North America, Latin America, Africa, and Europe. Now, before we dive into the panel, I'd first like to thank fellow collaborators FTI Consulting, BLG, Zuber Lawler, and Global Go Analytics, as well as sponsors Canamerx and Flower Hire. I'd also like to remind viewers that while this webinar is free, we encourage donations to the Last Prisoner Project, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to cannabis criminal justice reform and working to release and rebuild the lives of those individuals who have suffered from cannabis criminalization. If you would like to make a donation, please visit lastprisonerproject.org, as every bit counts. Now, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Tom Adams. Tom Adams is the CEO of Global Go Analytics, founded in April of this year to put data analytics to work in the strategic planning of cannabis companies and investors. Tom came into the cannabis industry as managing director of BDSA's Industry Intelligence Group, after doing similar strategic planning work for many of the big winners in the digital media and technology revolution we've all been living through these last couple of decades. Now, without further ado, please take it away, Tom.
Well, thank you, Simone. Great. Glad to be here, everybody. I was very excited as we got Global Go Analytics launched to find out that this project was in the works between all the distinguished partners that are doing it. And I realized as we put this panel together that you're talking about probably about a $5,000 an hour consult you're about to go through here. So feel free to, in fact, go ahead and pose questions that are germane to your specific issues. We won't be able to spend the hour on them, but you might get 2 minutes or so of a specific response as it fits into the general discussion we're going to have today of what regulations are and how they affect the markets around the world. So we wanted to kick things off by giving kind of a 10,000-foot view of things. And to do that, I've asked Maya Jasmine, who's Global Go Analytics Director of Insights and Analytics, to take us through some of the data we put together for the report. Maya's got a decade, or had a decade, of tech industry experience when she became Director of Research at BDSA in 2016, right after I joined the company. And there she developed and managed the worldwide cannabis forecast product and was a major contributor to the ArcView BDSA State of Legal Cannabis Markets report, to which I view our Law and Markets report as a worthy successor as we dig even deeper into the regulatory impacts that the way the market is organized by regulators impacts who wins and who loses. So let me throw up our slides here real quick. Maya's actually in New Orleans and running on generator power, and appreciate her getting here for this very much so, but she's asked me to run the slideshow. So let me share screen really quick, and then we'll ask Maya to take us through some of her findings. Maya?
Yes, so hello everybody. What you see for North America, is that they'll be dominant, and they are dominant and will be dominant for the foreseeable future. Global Go has them at 91% or 98%, sorry, of the 21.7 billion market in 2020. But they take a notable drop to 91% of the 55.2 billion by 2025. And this is according to Brightfield Group's projections. So, and while North America is the lion's share of the market, we don't want to sleep on the emerging and new markets that are coming in Europe, Latin America, Africa, and eventually Asia, because they will be the fastest growing markets because there's so much potential there. And you just have to realize that there's opportunity in every corner of the world, and having a companion guide like the Law Markets report is where you'll see what how regulatory framework plays into getting a piece of that opportunity. So we can go to the next slide, Tom. So we'll start with looking at, just as an example, Colorado, which we deem a forefather of the full legalization in North America and globally, because they went legal in 2014, and we saw them explode into the giant that they are now, the multi-billion-dollar market that they are now. And a lot of people tend to count them as mature or established since they are one of the front runners. But what we saw in 2019, 5 years into full legalization, that there was a regeneration of growth in that market, both in the medical aspect and also in the adult use aspect. And it was the first time we saw regeneration of growth in an adult use market that far into legalization. And what that tells us is that even in maturing or established markets, there is still opportunity for growth. So as global markets come on and they establish themselves far into their tenure, there'll still be opportunity for you to get into markets and to really capitalize on the growth in those markets. Next slide, please. We thought that Illinois was interesting to look at because there are a lot of lessons you can learn, especially with major markets like New York coming online in North America. Because Illinois, there is the data that they present, there's a split between in-state consumers and out-of-state consumers. And what we see is that in-state consumers obviously are the majority, but there is about between 20 and 30% monthly of out-of-state consumers that come into the state just to purchase cannabis. And what that tells us is that you have to be aware of the regulatory environment of your neighboring markets to see how you can either capitalize on it or to make sure that your domestic market really sees the full burgeoning of the opportunity that's there. Because if you overtax or overburden your consumers and you have a neighboring market that is legal as well, they can just exit and go and purchase there. And we say that a lot in Illinois. And with New York coming online, you really want to make sure that Massachusetts, or understand that Massachusetts is right there and they can capitalize on those consumers as well.
Cool, Maya, thank you. Yeah, and that's what really this session's all about, is comparing regulations across the markets and thinking about the impacts of what's going on as far afield as Colombia, for example, as what's happening in Switzerland. So it's a world market already, and we hope to draw that picture for you today and show you why it's critical to think about these cross-market comparisons. So to do that, we have a great panel of folks that do just that all day. They're specializing in specific markets, but very much trying to contemplate this worldwide picture. So let me introduce the panel, and then we'll get into it. Just a quick introduction here. Their websites, of course, have more details on their careers and such, but let's kick it off by introducing Lincoln Eckhart. Lincoln's the co-leader of FTI Consulting's cannabis practice, where he specializes in valuation and economic damages and often serves as an expert witness in economic disputes. FTI is a global publicly traded business advisory firm with a dedicated cannabis practice now. And Lincoln and his FTI colleagues wrote some of the key material in the report on the value chain, market entry rules across markets, and some of the key US states that they're expert in. So welcome, Lincoln. And next, we'll be hearing from Ryan Fingerhut, who's a former practicing attorney, now director at Global Go, where he focuses on cannabis consulting, licensing, and compliance issues. He boasts a phenomenal 99% track record on license applications for his clients and is an expert on cannabis license valuations and risk issues. And all that shows up in the cross-market comparisons he wrote for the report that tie all the key regulatory themes together. So thank you for all that great work, Ryan, and welcome today.
Thank you.
Sib Zaba is the founder of Global Go Africa and is a chartered financial analyst who worked as a banker at Goldman Sachs and Investec in London for over 8 years, and has worked subsequently with African governments, sovereign wealth funds, central banks, pension funds, insurers, and asset managers, closing transactions worth over 5 billion. I shouldn't say since then, that was as at Goldman Sachs and Investec. But has joined the cannabis revolution here and is following events in Africa and wrote a lot of that chapter of the report. Next up, Luis Miguel Lopez is Executive Vice President of Access Ventures Mexico and the Business Development Director for Global Go Mexico. His pre-cannabis industry work was advising governments and companies in the oil and gas sector, agriculture, and food industries for Asian and Latin American markets. He serves as president as well of Canna Invest, a business summit that explicitly promotes social responsibility while promoting investment in the cannabis industry. And then Nicholas Rosso Colomer is Chief Legal Counsel at Global Go Colombia. He's a master lawyer in international business and foreign investment with years of experience in ethics and compliance, risk management, and monitoring regulatory matters for governments and private entities and associations. And then finally, Andrew Petronanos is head of Global Go Switzerland, serving the entire European cannabis market from there. He's been a founder, manager, and engineer in industries like hospitality, technology, international engineering, energy, and finance. And in 2019, after working in wealth management and commodities trading, he founded his own consulting firm, FineLeaf, to focus on legal cannabis in Europe, and became a founder then of Global Go Switzerland. So Ryan, in your intro to the Law and Markets report, you provide a great checklist of what issues regulators are deciding for this industry. And I wanted to quote from it. Everything from business model, ownership, product lines, financing options, operational requirements, and even who can purchase cannabis, of course, the most fundamental issue. In most of these industries, of course, these things are decided by consumers or business strategists. But of course, governments have more to say about how this market develops than any other in history that I've followed anyway. And so I wanted to start with kind of the big picture. We're going to talk in very minute detail about, medical only markets and other things, but really the big picture here is that cannabis is going legal worldwide. And that means that the number of consumers, for one thing, is going to be the chief driver of revenue in these markets worldwide. And so I wanted to take a kind of a long-term look at the potential of some of these markets to start with. Because again, worldwide legalization at the adult level is coming. So which countries, states, provinces in the regions you've looked at are likely to be the big markets long-term? And I'd like to kind of get everybody's quick take on that one. Why don't we start with you, Ryan, though?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head that access to consumer populations is one of the big market drivers. We can see that that is especially true, just taking sort of Europe as a microcosm. Germany, which has given a lot of access to patients to be able to get prescriptions for medication. It's doing head and shoulders above when it comes to domestic market performance from, say, the UK, which is largely just an export market because they're having such difficulty getting their physicians to write scripts for a domestic market. So for me, because the majority of the world is a medical only market, the first thing I look at when I try to gauge how quickly you can see a domestic market grow is how permissive is the medical scripting, not just in what sort of ailments are you allowed to write scripts for, but also how difficult is it, the barriers to entry for doctors to be able to write those scripts. Florida is a good example of that, where right now it's got a very healthy patient population. Originally, it took a very long time for that to happen because they had a relatively difficult process for physicians to be able to be authorized. But as they lowered that process, made it a little bit easier, and as more and more physicians went through that process, which is really a coursework that they had to do, you've seen an exponential growth in patients. Outside of that, when you look at, say the United States and a few other, Canada, adult use markets, then it really has a tendency to really be about population and consumer behavior in that particular area of the country. So those are the two ways I look at it.
Yeah, indeed. And we're seeing that in Canada and kind of some of the cross-provincial comparisons where, the big markets are turning out to be where there are a lot of cannabis consumers, British Columbia, the big cities of Ontario, for example. But some of the countries around the world are just at that threshold moment where they're about to go from, typically in the US, maybe 2% of the population gets a medical card, but then suddenly you've got maybe 20% of adults able to come into stores when you go adult legal. So I wanted to ask Luis to tell us about Mexico a little bit at this point. It seems to be on the very verge of taking the big step. Where do things stand with legalization in Mexico, Luis?
Thank you very much, Tom. Hello, everybody. It's an honor to be participating in this webinar. Mexico, like any other country in the world, has been experiencing the different changes in the political arena regarding the cannabis full legalization. Okay, and we have been waiting for the general cannabis law that will regulate all the different aspects of cannabis in Mexico. But we have been waiting for more than 5 years for that. And it seems like we are in the final steps. Next month, it will be discussed by the Senate. We expect the Senate to make 17 big changes of what the law draft made by the lower chamber was delivered to the Senate. So it has to come back again to the lower chamber where the discussion is going to be a little bit rough. But we hope that in March or April, we're going to have the new law in place. It means that until February or March of 2022, we are not going to have licenses. But at the end, we think that this is the final steps that we have to take in Mexico. Meanwhile, let me say that about 2 months ago, something wonderful happened. The Supreme Court in Mexico say that all Mexicans have the right to use cannabis for recreational purposes. So it was a historic ruling from the Supreme Court, but we're still in a gray area because it's illegal to sell it and it's illegal to distribute it, but it's not illegal to smoke it. So we are in a kind of a gray area here. So what's happening right now in Mexico? I'm going to be very clear. All cannabis production, distribution, and cultivation are prohibited in Mexico, according to the law. But we are in a very special situation because everybody knows that it's going to be legal. So the authority, the police, and judges, and all the legal system is getting a little bit relaxed about it. You know, we are passing through like a toleration period in Mexico because it's crazy. You're not going to believe this. Mexico is becoming the first importer of cannabis from the US. and we are talking of premium cannabis products to very cheap products. All the different kind of products that you can find in the US are being sold right now on Mexican streets. And the most interesting thing is that I've seen small shops in shopping malls selling CBD or different products, and nobody cares. You know, the authority, they say, oh no, it's gonna be illegal. I don't want to know about it. But the truth is that it's illegal. Okay, so we are now in a very special period, to say the least, where it's being tolerated, but it's not legal yet. So, so it's a tricky situation because I got many questions from different potential investors that want to get into the Mexican market, and I say, listen, it's not a good idea to go into the Mexican market without a license, but on the other hand, a lot of people are doing it right now.
Yeah.
So like it happened before in the US, you know, most of my friends in the US and Canada, they were illegally working before they got their licenses. So it's a very difficult situation, but the most important thing, and I will finish with this, the most important thing is that we're gonna have a law that we call the whole enchilada. That's how we call it, because it's going to comprehend all kind of different uses you can think of in the cannabis industry. So we're going to have recreational, we're going to have industrial, we're going to have hemp, we're going to have medical, pharmaceutical, cosmetics, all kind of uses. This is one of a kind legislation, in my opinion, in the world, and I don't know if it's a good idea, but nevertheless they're going to make it. They're going to make full legalization all of a sudden. They're not going to start little by little, but there are a lot of questions, and so I will suggest that you keep record of what Global Go is going to be posting about it, because there are going to be a lot of changes, debate in Mexico. And of course, it's going to be the biggest market in the world for a couple years before the US comes to the federal level legally. But you have to be careful in the Mexican market. You have to be very careful. You need strong markets to guide you step by step on the Mexican market, and especially in the regulatory framework. You know, it's complicated. It's not like in the US. And I know that a lot of companies are being scammed right now in Mexico, companies from Canada and the US mainly. There are people saying that they have licenses when there are no licenses. Okay,
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Tom.
Yeah, it's interesting. And SIBS, another country where the courts got well ahead of the legislature, is South Africa, where you're located. There's been a court ruling there, right, that said essentially the same thing. There's a right to cannabis consumption, but so catch us up from then till now. How close is South Africa from having adult use legal operations?
Sure. So, Louise, I must say that it does feel that Mexico is copying South Africa in terms of how it's moving forward with the cannabis industry, because in 2018, South Africa's Constitutional Court ruled that the cultivation and consumption of cannabis in a private space is a human right. And that really sort of set in motion the tone in terms of very strong civil society and political structures to really have a robust cannabis industry. The industry as it stands today is really defined in sort of two spheres. Number one is the legalization of CBD, so trading of CBD products and so forth. That has resulted in quite a number of international players and local players establishing brands and sort of trading relationships. Although it's still fairly at a very, very small scale relative to the US, Europe, and so forth, but it has at least begun to sort of get the broader population, particularly the more sort of elderly and the more conservative, groups within the populace to start to ask questions about cannabis and really sort of explore its medicinal value and properties. And then secondly, it has really been a story of medical cannabis license facilities. South Africa has, over the last 18 months or so, issued about 29 licenses for the cultivation and processing of cannabis, with about just 3 months ago, I think, was the first exports out of South Africa. So I think there's, by our estimate, something like I think two tons or so that have left the country. But really at the heart of the South African cannabis industry is the National Master Plan, which has been in development over the last 2 years, led by the Department of Agriculture, and it was presented to Parliament last week. And the Master Plan basically sets the scene for the roadmap for very comprehensive legal cannabis industry in South Africa. It touches on medicinal, industrial, and adult use cannabis. And I do think that adult use is perhaps the last mile of that journey. I think hemp is the priority in terms of sort of establishing a robust local industry. So from October, South Africa will begin to accept applications for hemp, commercial hemp permits, which we think will really sort of be the engine room of the cannabis industry in the short term. We then think that the local medical cannabis industry will begin to open up, because currently those facilities can only export cannabis and they can't distribute it locally. So a framework needs to be put in place to allow for local distribution of medical cannabis products. And then I think that last stretch will be adult use, but because South Africa has over 900,000 smallhold farmers that currently grow cannabis, for a living, government has made it clear that they intend to shift those individuals into a legal framework. So, Louise, as I was saying, I think Mexico does seem to be copying us with sort of how we are moving forward as an industry. So I think we do need to, you need to keep a close eye on us to see how things will play out.
Well, it sounds like the race is on. Actually, they may beat you to this next turn. It sounds like, but at least both countries are moving forward. Let's switch to looking at Europe, of course, kind of the big prize, but it's not just one big prize, because despite all the efforts at Unity, there's every country has to make this happen on its own. Andrew, what's your view of where things stand in Switzerland, but also throughout Europe and moving towards adult use?
Hey, Tom, thank you, and great to be on the panel discussion with a lot of my colleagues of Global Go. I think we've never really all been in a panel discussion before, so it's very exciting to speak about the book and cover the markets. I think, look, it's very, very exciting, Tom. What is happening in the industry and how it's moving, it's amazing. I think from Switzerland's point of view, they have been pioneers. As we know, we do have the 1% THC allowance here. 2016, CBD was allowed to be sold as a smokable flower, as a tobacco substitute. So that really created a new industry here. And everybody has been looking at Switzerland in terms of the CBD flower and hemp cultivation for smokable products. I think what's also exciting and putting Switzerland back on the map is them launching a recreational pilot project, which is the first applications were allowed to come in on the 15th of May. Basically, the government here voted on changing the law to an ordinance where it is a scientific research project. So we have to highlight that. It's not a recreational opening, but it's a way of testing on how would a society react if suddenly you had legal cannabis. I can talk quite extensively about it, but it is a very exciting time. We're seeing universities and associations and institutes putting together research protocols to be signed off by the Federal Office of Public Health here and the government, which hopefully, it is a program that is 5 years plus 2, so we're going to see it 9 years. We kind of hope that we can have some model examples that we can maybe push on legalization in the space of the next 5 years. But to move away from Switzerland, also exciting is probably what's happening currently in Germany. Not only on the medical cannabis side, I vouch to what Ryan was saying between Germany and the UK. But what's exciting is the elections that are coming up in Germany on the 26th of September. And there, you already have the Green Party. They do have to form a coalition. So a lot of politicians are supporting legalization. However, looking at the big giant, and probably everybody knows this, is what is going to happen in the US. Because I think if the US comes around and legalizes cannabis, then everybody will follow suit. But maybe Germany might do it first, you know, and suddenly the European market will be completely different ballgame to what it is now, which is medical, right? And I'm sure we're going to talk about this in a minute, but I think what you have to understand and going to the conversations earlier is the fact of how is it regulated in your country and what loopholes can you create in order to sell your product. And, you know, speaking with SIBs extensively and also the guys from Colombia, on what do you bring for CBD? Because everybody's like, okay, CBD market has opened up in Europe. Let's kind of go in and bring our products. And then suddenly you've seen like products being removed because you have to make sure that CBD oil is, if it's consumable, it actually falls under novel foods. So we've seen that happening over the last few years. But now there's a new loophole that you could put CBD oil in your mouth, but classified as a cosmetic, right? Because it's actually for cleaning your teeth, let's call it that, right? So it's, you know, it's exciting. I think, like Luis was saying, and everybody, you know, a lot of people were in the finding loopholes in order to, you know, have your business going and creating revenues, but you are running at a risk, right? So it's always like, can I do it? Or let's try this. So you have to have good lawyers, you have to understand the regulation in each market you're going to. And I guess this is what we're here for, right? Global Go and Global Go Global to make sure that we can help you create your perfect strategy.
Yeah, indeed, which someday will not be a loophole strategy, but a mainstream strategy, which will be
correct.
Yeah. You had a great comment there about how society reacts when suddenly you have adult use. And Lincoln, I suspect you may have looked at that issue both in Canada and at every U.S. state that's had that moment come. What's been learned about what regulations make that transition work and lead to the replacement of an illicit market by the illegal market?
Yeah, I mean, it's a critical question because, as we know, the illicit market is still sort of the major player in the industry. I think in the the U.S. about $48 billion is the size of the illicit market, about 2 times the legal market, and represents about 70% of the total market. So the illicit market is still very strong. The challenge is, how do we develop regulations, a regulatory framework, the economics that allows the adult use market, the legal market, to compete with the illicit market? And it's definitely proven to be challenging. I think the illicit market is sort of the Achilles heel of any legal operator in the U.S. and in Canada. I mean, Canada is the same. The illicit market is still the dominant player. I think the keys to the success of a productive adult use market is really based on 2 primary factors. First is the existence of a well-established medical market. I think South Dakota is the only state in the U.S. that legalized legalized adult use without having a pre-existing medical market. Of course, South Dakota is still, at this point, uncertainty as to if that actually comes to fruition. But every state in the U.S. and in Canada first started with a medical market and then transitioned to an adult use market. And I think the reason that's sort of the logical path is because having a productive medical market ensures you have the infrastructure, the professional know-how, access to biomass, an informed and engaged consumer base, and you have experienced regulators, right? So when regulators look at this problem of how do we promote a cannabis legal market, the emergence of a medical market allows those regulators to kind of get up to speed, learn the industry. I mean, it's as we all know, it's a very complex industry. It's not just, it's agriculture, it's consumer product goods. It's really the whole value chain, cultivation through retail. So there's a lot of sort of hurdles, steps, and challenges along the way. So I think getting the regulators and the consumers and the businesses all having that experience of running a medical market leads to the success or likely success of an adult market. Of course, the speed of that rollout, the speed of the transition from a medical market to an adult use market is quite disparate. We've seen, I think Arizona set the record about 60 days they rolled out their adult use market from their medical, where Massachusetts, it took a couple of years. But it seems like states are getting more adept at this transition from medical to adult. And really, in order for the adult use market, once it's approved or legalized, for it to be successful, again, competing with the illicit market, it's really, I think, a question of balance. You need a balance of a regulatory framework and licensing scheme that promotes a competitive legal market that can compete with the illicit market. Challenging, it's easy to see, we've seen it time and time again, where there's a significant imbalance between supply and demand. In Canada, that's especially true, where we talked earlier about you can still find growth. And this is, if we look at the report, we discussed this at length, where there's still tremendous opportunities, even in a mature market like Canada, because of the issues with the regulations, there was a lot of the growth that was expected early on in the market never came to fruition. Now, as the regulations sort of mature and we see retail actually being rolled out, storefronts being opened, there's now supply and access for consumers. And so, balancing the regulatory framework with the licensing and the demographics plays a key role in the success of that adult market. Also, I think balancing tax revenue with competitive pricing. Yes, we need to generate taxes from cannabis for a host of reasons, but the taxings can't be so oppressive that you have a situation where legal cannabis is 2x the price of illicit cannabis. You're never going to convert that mass of consumers if they're paying twice as much for essentially the same product. And also balancing the rights of local jurisdictions to regulate cannabis with providing significant or sufficient adult access to flower and to the various cannabis products. Obviously, we saw in Ontario, you had, I think, a population of 13 million people, and you only had at one point, 40 or so storefronts. So we need to be able to develop the infrastructure and the access to those products. And also, I think finally, we have to balance the promotion of social equity programs with the interest of these, large multi-state operators or national operators. States have to reinvest that portion of the tax revenue into these social programs and ensure non-predatory capital to allow social equity applicants to be able to compete with these multi-state operators. So it's a complex challenge. The illicit market is alive and well. It's a real detriment to the success of the legal market, but there are ways to promote the adult use market, and it starts with a regulatory framework that makes sense and allow for competitive pricing and access to the products.
Yeah, interesting. Let's in fact then dial back a little bit. You talked about how a solid medical basis is critical for this adult world to open up and function properly. And so much of the world is clearly going to be medical only for quite some time. So let's focus on those areas. And maybe I could ask Nicolas to kick it off there with a look at Latin America, which looks very much like it's going to remain very medical only for the next 5 years or so, shall we call it?
Definitely.
Yeah, but very interested.
Yes,
very interested in exporting cannabis to both medical and adult use markets worldwide. So, what's going on with Colombia and some of the other countries in Latin America in terms of balancing, building a medical business while focusing on that export market as well?
Okay. Thank you very much, Global Go colleagues, for this webinar. Yes, I think in Latin America, the adult legal operations is not the priority for any government, I would say. So far, in the Colombian case, there have been several attempts in the Senate to present laws regarding the adult use, but none of them have been succeeded. whatsoever. I think that there are two main issues that won't open that door in the short term. One is definitely, I think, the violent culture of Colombia around the trafficking and drugs is not is not well seen by any government, I would say, but any political party, not of this government, not of by the opposition. So I don't think that is I don't see that new initiatives in the short term. The other element is I think that there is a cultural barrier in here. It's not easy. These are, in general terms, I think Latin America is a very conservative society, and I don't see this government or the next ones promoting or trying to boost the adult use of cannabis. However, on the other hand, finally, after 4 years of waiting, the government finally issued a new regulation on medical cannabis that we'll talk about it later, but definitely opened so many doors from the export, the dry flower export to kind of finished products and food and beverage, all kind of products that now can be forced. No, I think the adult use operations, that door is closed so far.
Yeah, it's got a, if we kind of just look at the range of regulatory situations in the medical markets worldwide, there's an incredible diversity, right? Everything from markets like Colombia and Brazil, for example, measured in the barely couple $2 billion range because they're largely made up of the importation of finished products from countries where they're being manufactured. Essentially there is no infrastructure being built because the regulations don't allow for it. So it's just individual patients getting their drugs, from overseas. To, let's say, well, how about Oklahoma? Perhaps the most liberal medical only market in the world, where 10% of the population has a medical card now. There's a store on every corner. And in fact, you can smoke cannabis wherever you can smoke cigarettes. Which is less and less places, of course, in the world, but still pretty public situation there. So from everybody, kind of take a look at this, if you would, in your region of the world. What is the range of medical regulations, and how does that impact the prospects for market growth, and therefore in your regions, which are the likely biggest and fastest growing of the medical only markets? Maybe we can start with Sibs as far as Africa goes.
Sure. So what I would say is that for most of Africa, it sort of has been a reluctant shift towards legalizing cannabis, just because they still, the historic views about cannabis being a dangerous substance, a gateway drug, highly addictive, all these negative stereotypes. But if we had to sort of take a scan of the continent, I think that South Africa in many ways is going to lead the charge in terms of a domestic market with looking at cannabis. So the master plan it touches on medical cannabis. It touches on research, development, and technology applications around cannabis, and it really is, I think, for the next sort of call it 2-3 years, going to be the largest market. South Africa has a very strong pharmaceutical sector. It's got a fairly strong sort of middle class, despite, I think, some of the economic challenges over the last sort of couple of years with considerable buying power and a strong medical insurance industry as well. So I think South Africa will be the engine room in terms of a medical cannabis market. But I think also another country which has, kind of quietly indicated that they are also looking to have a domestic medical cannabis market is Rwanda. Rwanda is, a very small landlocked country, but arguably the African country with the best corporate governance, or the best governance and corporate governance, and also, one of the fastest growing countries in the world, growing sort of north of 7% a year over the last decade or so, even longer. And so I think with South Africa sort of leading the charge from a, let's say, scale or total addressable market perspective, and Rwanda, which is very much the beacon in terms of economic policy, in terms of sort of an anti-corruption sort of overlay, I think can really also help other West African and Central African countries realize the value of a domestic market. But generally speaking, so far, all African countries have legalized for export only. And so I think with those two countries, sort of leading the charge, we'll start to see the dominance slowly fall in other countries across sub-Saharan Africa.
Okay, cool. We'll get back to the export issue in a second, but just limiting ourselves to kind of viewing these markets as medical markets. Let's look at Europe next and ask Andrew if he can kind of handicap the countries there, where we have everything from Germany with a pretty liberal list of conditions that can be treated and doctors kind of fully engaged, to say France with 2,000 test patients allowed to finally get their hands on cannabis. And then of course the big prize, UK. So maybe just kind of focusing on, well, frankly, either those three or some of the dark horse countries that may not be on people's radars, but are likely to be healthy medical cannabis markets. What do you think?
Sure. Absolutely. I think you're quite right, Tom. To be honest, actually, the second largest medical cannabis market is actually Italy, which has been a sleeping horse for quite a while. There's a license that was given out by the government to the military, which is grown in the lovely Tuscan hills. But then there wasn't enough supply, so the government has to release a tender. So if you're a supplier, you have to pitch for that tender. We know Dutch producer called Bedrocan that is supplying flour to the Italian market. But then here's a catch: it's not really flour; it's flour that goes in to get extracted, that the pharmacist makes a final production step, which is a magistral compound. And even though you're understanding the medical cannabis market in Europe, of course, it's exciting because it's growing. So if we go back to Germany, it's actually driven by patients and consumers rather than what it should be, doctors being educated to write a prescription. And then it's driven again by pharmacists. So actually how it works is a patient goes and says to the doctor, oh, I've heard that this cannabis flower that's available in that pharmacy is good for me. So the doctor writes a prescription. And here is the whole thing about reimbursement side as well, which is interesting on the medical cannabis market, is that if you're a doctor, you cannot get reimbursement for health insurance unless you can prove that that flower or that product actually is good enough for that pain that the doctor wrote a prescription. So most people go private, right? So it's a way to access cannabis and say, look, I've heard cannabis is good for it. So that's Germany, I think, is probably the most exciting market, and it will be for the foreseeable future. Whereas if we go back to the UK, like Ryan was talking earlier, you have to make sure that it's a prescription written by a specialist. So the NHS does not support it yet. So you have to be, it's a specialist, so it has to be a neurologist, it cannot be a family doctor or a GP. And you have to prove that that patient has had 2 other medications that have failed before a prescription can be written. So it's, it creates so many barriers for the patients to have access. But then also there's a lot of barriers from a producer getting their product or flower might be into those markets. And as we know from a lot of the North American companies that want to come into Europe, they have to fall under EU GMP, which is the highest standard of pharmaceutical production. And that also has created a whole different dynamic. And then finally, not to put a dampener, because the market is growing and it's very exciting, and I say a couple of new countries that are coming in the map, is that you have the EU GMP standard, but also now you're seeing this whole price dynamic, right? So yes, there is demand growing, there is way oversupply. There's not enough supply to EU GMP standard, but that is coming. And now you're getting medical cannabis flower as low as $2 a gram, right? Okay, that's to the wholesaler, then it goes to the pharmacy, then they put 100% margin to the patient. So it is growing, it is exciting. There are quite a lot of barriers, but I agree with you, France. Again, I think it's a political side where what do you allow? Should we accept it? Is this okay? And a lot of doctors in Europe are asking, first of all, clinical data, like, is this efficacy of this product good enough? And we've discussed this also about South Africa with SIBS. And the second part is, there is still the stigma, right? So, am I prescribing it as a smoke of a flower? No, that's not allowed. So I give you something, you can measure the doses, but you can take it whichever way you want, right? So there's just so many sensitivities, so many barriers. Nobody really wants to sign things off. No politicians really want to go fully behind it. But to be honest, there is movement and there's no going back. And there is enough movement from consumers. There's enough movement from pharmacies. There's enough now lobbying from companies. And it was also really important to see, having been in the space now for 3 years in Europe, is you're seeing now capital coming in, right? And whether we had some of the companies in the UK that went public on the London Stock Exchange, you saw now one company went public in Frankfurt. So really there is momentum, which before it wasn't. Before investors were holding back, doctors were holding back, and now I think the CBD craze really created a huge momentum. And this whole medical cannabis, so Europe is fully medical cannabis at the moment. Let's see what happens. I think it's exciting.
Yeah. And let's take a look at the US and Canada real quick with Lincoln and Ryan. Among the medical only, or the medical, especially the US, obviously, where there are still all the ink goes to the new adult use states, but some of the medical only states are the biggest states in the country. And what do you think of the prospects there as far as the regulatory approach being taken in those states versus the prospects for the market? Maybe we can ask Ryan to kick that one off.
Sure, I was just thinking you would go with Lincoln since he wasn't muted. Yeah, I think that's worth noting. I think that a lot of the comments that everybody has said have been really hitting the nail on the head. What Andrew just said about the difficulty for patients getting access. Like I mentioned, Florida, which is one of the most successful states, did not have early success. They gained success as those barriers to entry were lowered and as physicians worked their way through. Another thing that actually wasn't mentioned, Arizona is another good example of a state like that, but something that wasn't mentioned that has also given Florida some of its earlier success, as well as Nevada, which is now adult use, but originally was medical only, and they saw a decent amount of success under their medical program, was the acknowledgement of medical tourism. So giving access not only to people who are your own citizens and being given scripts, but also giving access to medical patients from their own countries. Nevada did that by being the first state to allow for people from New Jersey or Michigan or wherever who came on vacation to be able to use the medical scripts from those states to gain access to medicine while they were on vacation. That also helped for a few patients who mainly came from jurisdictions that were more restrictive on what products were being allowed. They wanted access to those products, so they went to another state where they were able to get access, sometimes for prolonged periods of time. In the case of a few people, and this was a little bit earlier on, but Colorado, one of the first states to go to allow medical. A lot of people actually moved to the state or spent prolonged periods of time there so that their children could gain access to epilepsy medications. Florida also, because it's got a large transient population of older retirees who aren't really citizens of Florida, but who spend several months of time they allow their doctors to write scripts not only for citizens of the state, but also people who own or rent a piece of property in the state. So I think that you can also identify some early market movers. That's a way to sort of get around that initial punt, as everybody needs to gain access, is to allow access to out of state or out of nation medical patients as well. And we're seeing a few of the new countries, for instance, Ukraine, which is currently in the process of drafting their medical legislation. But the most recent draft did in fact include an allowance for people to bring medication across borders if they themselves were the patient, allow people who were patients in European countries and other countries to purchase medicine, once it becomes legalized in production in their domestic market there. But I think that that's a major thing that shouldn't be overlooked.
And
Tom, I would just add to that. I mean, I think Florida is a really fascinating case study, right? Because Florida started out with a very restrictive medical program that then was loosened to include, a lot more conditions. And initially, Florida didn't allow sale of flower, and then that was amended to allow the sale of flower. So you've seen this sort of evolution within a single medical program that had radical impacts to, not only for the consumers and the patients, but also for the companies operating there and what their economics look like and their valuations. I mean, valuations, what I focus on, and something like Trulieve, right? That's a very well-known cannabis operator that was very successful in Florida, and how Trulieve's sort of evolution as a company and their valuation and their economics mirrors the evolution of the cannabis medical program within Florida. It's just a really fascinating thing to study. I think, Tom, to your point, it's really a very, very wide spectrum. Alabama just recently, the governor just approved a medical program. It's probably gonna be the most restrictive in this country, maybe not surprisingly. You're not gonna have flower, edibles, vapes, and you're gonna have very limited conditions that would qualify for it. To something like Oklahoma, where, as you said, 10% of the population has a card. It's unlimited licenses, so you can have as many storefronts as they can be, and it's really sort of the two polar opposites, but both considered to be medical program. So from when you look at companies that are operating in the industry, it's really sort of critical to understand what markets these companies are operating in and understanding those individual markets. And I think that's what's so great about this report that we've all worked on and done, because it allows someone that's maybe new to the industry to really understand the minute detail of every regulatory market, or almost every regulatory market place, and what those regulations look like, what the economics look like, what the laws look like, and provides a great overview of these very stratified markets within the cannabis industry.
Yeah, indeed. Well, let's take expand our focus a little bit in the few minutes we've got left here. And actually, we are going to run a little long, by the way, folks. So if you do have questions, we'll have some time to take those under advisement and get you some of this high-priced advice here on your specific issues in your own markets or ones you're looking at, of course. So just put those in the chat, and Simone's assembling those. But I wanted to kind of back up and take a look at the import-export issue that's just such a key opportunity for companies eventually, in any case. And we'll talk about that and kind of some crystal ball gazing at the end here. But in the near term, the import-export situation is so fascinating in that it's so many of the very tightly restricted markets in their domestic markets, such as Mexico to date and Colombia to date, that really are in hot pursuit, South Africa to date for that matter too, in hot pursuit of this export opportunity. And what have we seen so far about who's succeeding at that game? And what do we think the prospects are going forward? Is it going to be the case that proximity matters someday, and the idea of shipping all the way from, say, Uruguay to Germany is going to be a stretch at some point because there'll be so much being grown in domestically? In Italy, we already have kind of the battle between domestic and imports going on, and Germany is just launching, right, with the domestic suppliers just coming on board. So how's that going to shake out? And then of course, the model is the US, where there is no interstate commerce and everybody's growing their own. So I'm kind of interested in your thoughts about how that's developing today, while exports are a real challenge, headed towards that day where there's just a normal import-export market worldwide. And whoever's got a thought on that, I'd let you just jump in. And I should have picked somebody.
Sure. So
Yeah.
what I would say is that, no, we spend a lot of time and energy on this, in terms of looking to facilitate African licensed producers to export mainly to Europe, Israel, and Australia. And I think there's a couple of things. The first one is that I would say, in terms of the African industry sort of calibrating their sort of product to be suitable, not only from a certification perspective, but also from a certificate of analysis perspective, so cannabinoid profile, microbials, and so forth. It does take some time. I think we've seen that with Lesotho, which was the first African country to issue cannabis licenses. It took about 2 years before Lesotho started to move product at sort of a decent scale. I think this year, by our estimates, Lesotho operators have moved, I think, around 8 or 9 tons of cannabis internationally. South Africa's just started, so you sort of had a situation in South Africa where we same situation, took about a year or two, but this year we've really started to sort of move decent sort of volumes of products to sort of Switzerland, Israel, and the UK. But I think the big challenge sort of around the sort of export thesis is that a lot of the local licensed producers just have not set up facilities that are of a standard that international buyers can sort of be happy to buy product from. And I think even in the case where facilities are of very high spec facilities and so forth, product quality sometimes becomes an issue, and it does take some time to calibrate that. So I think, if we're being realistic, what is quite important here from an African perspective is the development of domestic markets in order to sort of allow these early movers to be able to generate some cash flow that can allow them to invest further capex to get to a level where they can have the right types of sort of facilities, and sort of ensure that on sort of the genetics and the cannabinoid profiles, they've had some time to sort of do an element of R&D to fine tune their end products as well.
Yeah.
And
Go ahead.
I think what's interesting, of course, Sibs and I have had extensive conversations about this and trying to help some South African clients bring their product into Europe. I think what's important to highlight, Tom and everyone, is what is it that you want to import and export, right? If we're talking about medical cannabis, where is it going to go, right? So Canada has their own production, US has their own production, so everybody that is producing is going to look in Europe, because that's really where the patients are growing. And then you're talking about EU GMP certification, and we talked about this with some South African producers. SAPRA GMP is now starting to get recognized under PICS. So import and export can happen, provided that you follow, first of all, this long-winded quality standards, and as a GDP or GMP importer into your country, you have to qualify first your producer, right, in order to hold your license. And then once you qualify him, you have to go to the regulator and say, look, I want to import this product to supply it in my medical market. And then the regulator has to be sent out there. And currently the waiting list for Germany is 12 to 14 months, right? So you might have your harvest, everything is ready to go, and suddenly it's just going to take you another 14 months to get it in. So that's, I'd say, first is, what do you want to import and export? And then the second part, if you're looking at your sort of wellness market, let's call it CBD hemp side, suddenly there's so much production. And I give you a quick outline on pricing from what I even received today in Switzerland. So if you look in 2016, indoor cultivated CBD flower was selling at about 5,000 Swiss francs, dollars, let's call it a kilo, right? Suddenly last year, even after last year, 2019, I think the rough figure was about 2,500 Swiss francs a kilo, right? Suddenly you had about 600, 700 new producers in Switzerland growing indoor CBD flower. The current price for indoor CBD flower is 450 francs a kilo, right? So, and that happens also because now we're having CBD flower for outdoor grown coming from Uruguay. Once Colombia is going to come in, that's also going to decrease. South African product coming in. So I think there is an exciting import and export trading business, but it all depends where it's going, who really does have the demand. Is it going to be medical? Is it recreational? And I think what's probably really exciting is what Luis mentioned earlier about, suddenly US supplying products to Mexico. And that's, I think probably illegally it was different years ago, right? So I think there is a huge import and export business, but I think a lot of producers have to come to a realization that if you're basing your economics to current market prices, you should really start having a good think about how will those markets shift in the future and what's your competition looking like. So that would be my sort of tick to think about.
Yeah.
And I guess that, Tom, I think related to that question is something that you just mentioned, which is, we talk about import export. There's a similar dynamic in the U.S. markets, right? Because every state is essentially siloed from every other state with no interstate commerce allowed. So I think one of the most fascinating questions is what happens when we do get federal legalization. There's been tremendous amounts of capital put into individual states to build out significant cultivation facilities. What happens there when all of a sudden California and Oregon can supply the entire country with cannabis at a much lower cost? So states will want to protect their sort of state barriers and the capital that's been invested there, but all of a sudden you have a legal market. So the evolution of the structural market issues will be fascinating, internationally as well as just domestically in the U.S.
Yeah, indeed. And in fact, that's kind of what I wanted to get to. Simone, although if there are questions, feel free to let us know and we can deal with that. But if not, I wanted to just take the last couple of minutes here to engage in a little crystal ball gazing around that moment you mentioned there, Lincoln, that what happens when the U.S. goes legal. Does that, it seems like in many ways that could change, will change everything, of course, right? But in which directions? And especially, I think I'd like to start on this import-export issue. First of all, I guess the key issue will be, do we expect that there will immediately be interstate commerce in the US, or is that going to be a battle? And then we'll talk about importing and exporting out of the US, but just among the states themselves. Ryan, that's probably something I suspect you thought about.
I have thought about this quite a bit, and unfortunately, I've got the famous attorney answer of it depends.
On what? Give us the on what.
So as Lincoln pointed out, and I'm gonna bring this to the international community as well, but as Lincoln pointed out, in the U.S., we have a little bit of an issue in that even though right now all the states are siloed because it's federally illegal, once it becomes legal at the federal level, there's a number of things in the Constitution, including a ban on creating barriers to entry between different states. That's going to play a pretty big role. Also, the regulation by the Food and Drug Administration of certain products, that's going to play in. And so how the federal government chooses to legalize, whether they deschedule, whether they fully legalize, how the regulatory agencies at the federal level get involved, there's going to be a lot of very complicated decision making. And frankly, I myself think that it's going to take a lot of legal minds, probably head and shoulders better than my own, to try to figure that out. And I don't think anybody is going to really have a clear crystal ball, because so many different states, so many different stakeholders are going to get involved in all sorts of ways.
Yeah.
And extrapolating that to the international community, we have the UN Treaty 1961 Single Convention on Narcotics. That has been, hearkened to by many different countries, especially in Europe, where those types of concerns might be taken a little bit more seriously than, say, the US or Canada or Mexico seems to be taking them. Because a lot of those countries have specifically said that our treaty obligations under this are why we can never allow adult use. We have to be medical, because at least as far as this UN treaty goes that we signed, it declares that cannabis is a dangerous substance that can't just be unregulated. It does create a window for medical use, but it doesn't really allow adult use. So we'll have to see either people willing to break their treaty obligations, or we'll have to see a concerted effort at the UN level to get that change, which we've already seen some movement there, but not enough to really allow for free trade the way that I think that we'd all or most people in the industry would like to see cannabis move, and they're not so far off.
Yeah, speaking of free trade, Lincoln, your point about California and Oregon being able to supply the country makes me think back to the days when Mexico and Colombia supplied the whole country, with a little bit of Thailand and some other exotic, Jamaica and other exotic locations. But Luis, what do you think of that? Is that something that Mexico has focused on in getting its domestic situation in place, or what's your thought about post-U.S. legalization and the role of Canada, U.S., and Mexico as a trading bloc already, when cannabis is part of that?
I think that any cannabis project that is basing their economics on exporting, I think they have a big risk of failure. They have to rely first on their own market, before thinking about exporting. And on the other hand, Mexico is a big domestic market, and we are analyzing a very interesting situation, because we thought 3 years ago that the Mexican customers will not pay for very expensive cannabis products. And now we are surprised to see premium brands like cookies, for example, being sold for the double of the price that you can buy it in the US. So it's crazy when you think about it. Mexicans, they really know about cannabis, and there is a big niche market that they are willing to pay whatever the price for a good product. So it's pretty surprising for us. And of course, there is also a very big market that will buy cheap products, that they will pay a very small price for that. So talking about export and import, I think that if we consider that in the next 10 years, the whole global market, the whole global cannabis market will be concentrated 70% in North America, talking about Canada, US, and Mexico. So everybody will try to get into those markets. That's where the big money is going to be for the first 10 years at least. I will say at least 20, but let's say 10 years. And when the European Union finally comes online with a good legal framework, of course, it's going to be a very interesting market, but it's going to take time. It's going to take longer than the US to become at the federal level legal. So if you want to be in the epicenter of the world cannabis market, you have to be in North America. And if we speak about Mexico, Mexico is in a very interesting position, because Mexico is the country with more free trade agreements signed in the world. Of course, they have a free trade agreement with Canada and the US, but also we have a free trade agreement with Europe, with the European Union and all the 27 countries that belong to the European Union. But also, this is interesting. This is when it becomes very interesting. We have a free trade agreement also with Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, and Chile. You know, so this is very interesting because if you produce in Mexico, you're going to be in a very strategic position to do a lot of things. So. Yeah. So we are looking forward that we are not going to be in the need in Mexico for the first years to export to Europe, for example. But on the other hand, we are going to be concentrated in the Mexican market, and I'm sure that Canadians and Americans will be concentrated in the Mexican market too, because it's already happening. I mean, nobody's planning this. We are very surprised to see what's going on right now. You know, 2 years ago, 78% of all the cannabis that was consumed in the US came from Mexico. You know, and now only 6% of the cannabis being consumed in the US comes from Mexico. Only 6%. And you mentioned. And we have all the way around. You know, we see a lot of different American brands going around here in Mexico, from Colorado, from California mainly, from New Mexico, and from Arizona mainly. Well-known brands that are being smuggled across the border from the US to Mexico. I mean, we never thought about that, my friend. So it's very interesting what's going on.
It really
Tom, can I speak on the crystal ball? Like,
yeah.
I think Luis' last statement brought up a good point. I think beyond the regulatory framework, that's when the marketing and branding comes into play when you go fully legal. Because, you know, you have to look past, if you brand a product and market a product, then regardless of where the consumer is, if you brand it right, they'll want that product. So that's where you move past the regulatory framework and into having a good go-to-market strategy for whatever your product is.
Yeah.
Market is God, Maya. Market is God. If the market wants it, you know, somebody's gonna get it and bring it to the market. That's for sure.
Absolutely. I think also to voice Luis and Maya there, I was gonna say exactly the same thing. I think, you know, it's the consumers that are going to drive it. So once it's federally legalized, I think the thing that's going to play the biggest role is, you know, how good is your story and how good is your brand in order to attract that consumer. And then it's a play of any other industry, whether you want to talk about wine or tobacco. But this is not medical, right? I think we have to take medical out. This is all recreation, and it will really be consumer packaged good. How good is your packaging? How sustainable are you? You know, where is your strain? Is it coming from the Alps in Switzerland, or, you know, a valley somewhere in South Africa, or, you know, it's really will all depend on that. And I think that's where the whole shift will change around. But yeah, let's see. I think we'll all be around the next 10 years to witness the excitement of it. And I hope we can consult quite a few companies that are wanting to move or create brands or strategy. That's what we're here for.
Yeah, I love the fact that Luis brought up the 20-year window there at the end. And it's fascinating to think about, and will be great to be there for. I think let's wrap it up though with that hopeful look forward to a dynamic free market worldwide. And remind everybody though that of course what we focused on in this report was what's the situation today regulation wise. That's what all the companies in the business have to deal with, of course, to get to that 20-year horizon. I'll kick it back to Simone to remind everybody about the report and what we're doing about it for attendees at the conference today. I want to thank everybody so much for joining us. We obviously could talk about this for many hours, and we'll have to do it again to do just that. So thanks, everybody.
Well, thank you all. That was a very engaging and informative discussion. I know it was impossible to cover everything in an hour and a half. So if you have more questions about the global cannabis market, or if you have direct questions for any of the panelists here, please visit globalgo.consulting. You can fill out a contact form and we'll make sure you get to the right person. I just want to remind everyone that as part of our promotion, every registered attendee here is going to receive an email tomorrow for a unique coupon code for a $100 discount off our digital copy of the report. And 3 lucky attendees will receive, who are randomly selected, are going to receive a free digital copy of the report. You'll receive a follow-up email tomorrow on how to download. I just want to say thank you again to our moderator, our panelists, our collaborators, our sponsors for another spectacular webinar. Special thanks to our attendees for your interest in the series, and we hope to see you again at our next webinar, which is going to be focused on the United Kingdom. So stay safe out there, and we'll see you again next time.
Thanks, guys.
Everybody.